What's up, guys? Welcome to Daily Dose of Reddit. This is your host, who is now paying the pet tax, apparently, that I was unaware of, but I mentioned that I had a bird on my shoulder in a previous video, and y'all demanded a picture, so here is an included picture of Miss Honey on my shoulder while I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt, because that is how I do it. Anyway, today's subreddit is r/ProRevenge, and she's cute, huh? This story's called Entitled Teacher's Kid Gets Absolutely Wrecked. Hey, this is my first time posting to this subreddit, but I posted in r/regularrevenge, and many folks told me to drop it here as well. I typically don't post anything, but I felt that this story was too good not to share. I was also emboldened after watching some r/content on YouTube. I hope you enjoy as much as I did. This might take a while as well. This is the tale of how an entitled and borderline sociopathic classmate of mine had her academic life ruined before it had even started over some petty bullcrap. Allow me to introduce her. I'll call her Karen Jr. Karen Jr. was a pretty decent student who made equally decent grades. Certainly nothing to scoff at. However, she didn't take any particularly hard classes, and it seemed as if she was merely skating by in high school, waiting for the greater things in life. She was also a mythic mean person. She had money and often flaunted it. She looked down on kids who didn't have as much as she did and was a classic case of spoiled butthole syndrome. She also had a habit of sending her mom on anyone who dared to rub her the wrong way. Let's talk about her. Her mom worked at the school as a math teacher and was very chummy with most of the other teachers, as well as the administration of both the school and the local county board. She was also a butthole. She would intentionally fail high-achieving students who might make her precious daughter look worse in the long run. We'll call this teacher Karen. As for myself, I was a senior in high school at the time of all this, class of 2019. I am currently a college sophomore. In high school, I was one of the top students in the class. My undergraduate studies have been entirely paid off by academic scholarships, and I was one of a handful who were poised to be valedictorian of our class. Of course, this title didn't mean much to me. I worked my ass off for scholarship money, not for some silly title. I'm saying this now not to brag, but because it's important to the story later. It's also important to note that this story takes place in the thick of college admission season. Seniors were scrambling to write essays, get important documents together, and raise standardized test scores before it was all said and done. I mostly only ever had class with Karen Jr. when I was taking courses required to graduate. These weren't hard classes at all, and certainly were not weighted. Typically, my other classes would be AP or dual credit courses to academically challenge myself and to raise my GPA for scholarships. I rarely had classes with Karen Jr. in any of these courses, and the class size was so small for APs at my school that if she had been, we would have been in the same class for sure. This was very odd, as she struck me as capable to handle the course load. That's when the Tom-lovery began. Tom fornication under consent to the kingery. You see, Karen Jr., like many other folks at this time, had also been trying to raise her test scores for college admissions. She claimed that she had anxiety, and as a result, she got some special accommodations whenever it was time to take tests, both for classes and standardized. However, she was notoriously extroverted in class discussions and never struck me as the nervous type. I have dealt with generalized anxiety disorder for years, and I wasn't buying it. I also didn't want to use this as a cop-out to get special privileges, but if that's what the psychologist note said, I didn't have an issue with it. For regular class tests, this meant that she got to leave the room and take her test somewhere else. She typically went to the library, where she could take it in a more isolated setting. There was a rare situation where we did share a class, AP US Government. The teacher was also great friends with Karen. At my high school, it was known as one of the easier AP classes due to the heavy focus on vocabulary and the lack of challenging concepts. We had tests in there on a 2-week basis after covering the material in the textbook. I would study my ass off for each and every test, and I always ended up with low A's. This was fine in my book, since the other assignments would keep my grade above the 95 mark. mark. As per usual, Karen Jr. would leave class every 2 weeks to take the test. That was all well and good until she got a 100% on every single test. She's a capable student, but she's certainly no genius. She would also flaunt to her friends how she never studies for any of her tests because she just gets it. This continued for the first little bit of the course, until one test day, the library was closed down after some water damage had been uncovered after a pretty bad storm. She couldn't take the test in the library as usual and had to take it with the rest of us. She seemed hesitant, but the teacher insisted that there was nowhere else suitable in the school for test taking, and so she took the test and gloriously bombed it. I don't know exactly what she got, but she had gotten all blubbery and teary-eyed as soon as she saw her grade. She claimed that it had been misread by the Scantron and insisted that it was rescored. She got the same score. I assumed that it was due to her anxiety, and I felt bad for her. That sympathy went away in an instant when, during class, she whispered to one of her friends that she'd always go to her mom's classroom instead of the library to take her tests. I always had a skill for eavesdropping, since I was a relatively unassuming person who didn't say much in class. I didn't know what this meant for sure, but I assume her mom, Karen, had looked up the answers for it. That explained immediately why she had gotten perfect scores on the previous tests and why she had bombed this one. However, her blatant cheating didn't affect me one bit, so I turned a blind eye and kept doing my own thing. Then, the situation escalated a slight bit. See, her anxiety also allowed her some special privileges for taking standardized college placement exams, like the ACT and SAT. One of my friends had a sister who genuinely had a learning disability and absolutely needed the extra time. She was incredibly sweet. We'll call the sister Destiny. Destiny explained to me that when you present to the ACT testing facility with accommodations, you had two options. You could either take each of the 4 ACT sections, 5 sections if you took it with writing, on separate days under normal time constraints, or take all of the sections on the same day with double the time on each section. Destiny also explained that all test takers with accommodations took the exam on the same day, different than normal test takers, so that they could ensure that each student's needs could be met. Destiny mentioned how Karen Jr. got a special room to take her tests in, not unlike her regular tests. That's all well and good, she thought, except when Destiny finished her exams, she noticed that Karen Jr. hadn't finished with the rest of the students. She assumed this meant that Karen Jr. had opted for the extended time option, until, on Karen Jr.'s social media, she posted about how she was ready for day 2 of ACT testing. Sure enough, she had taken it over the course of several days. All of this meant that somehow Karen Jr. had taken the ACT with both accommodation options. I wasn't sure how something like this would have even been possible. Karen Jr. got a spectacular score on her exam, something like a 32 or 33. Again, this didn't particularly bother me. Her test scores didn't affect me one bit. I decided to take the information with a laugh and move on with my life. This is when crap went from annoying to personal. You see, several students, including myself, were in the running to be our class's valedictorian. I didn't care too much since the distinction wouldn't have gotten me any extra money from the college I was planning on attending. It was quite a shock to learn that Karen Jr., beyond a shadow of a doubt, was going to be our valedictorian for that year. To me, and many others, this seemed impossible. She hadn't taken nearly as many weighted classes as a lot of us, and was a good student at best. Also, Karen Jr.'s best friend was lined up to be salutatorian, second in class rank. She was also a pretty mediocre student. So, how did they both manage to get a higher GPA than us? We had been taking AP since freshman year. The answer came to me as I was eating lunch one day. One of my friends, we'll call him Aaron, had been making up a calculus test in Karen Jr.'s mom, room. While he was there, he had overheard some seriously juicy information. Karen was looking at the student transcripts of high-ranking students, including myself, and had arranged for Karen Jr.'s schedule to inflate her GPA so much that it passed my own and the GPA of other hardworking students. This included taking some online classes from a local college, which I was never permitted to take. This is because the classes were so specific that the credits didn't transfer. We're talking about a college class about proper walking and exercising technique here. Easy crap. What's more concerning is that these student transcripts contained very sensitive information that included, but was not limited to, last 4 digits of social security, home addresses, phone numbers, medical history, approved medication, and academic records of all kinds. Why they'd openly whisper about this stuff with another student in the room is beyond me. I didn't want to take this information at face value, so I looked up the list of faculty that had permission to access student transcript information in the first place. Only a handful of teachers could do this. Wouldn't you believe that Karen's name was most certainly on the list? I also ran the numbers myself. It was totally possible to arrange a schedule of bullcrap classes that would exceed everyone else's GPA. The same had been done to Karen Jr.'s best friend's schedule, just not to the same extent. I was livid. That was my personal information, which, if leaked, could cause some serious privacy issues. Part of my social security number was on there, for Christ's sake. So I decided that I wasn't gonna take this lying down anymore. I looked up the regulations and codes regarding the share of a student transcript without consent, and whoo boy! All of that crap is under FERPA law. And if you don't know anything about FERPA, just know that they don't mess around in the slightest. The state penalties alone for sharing student documents with a third party without consent, either from the parent if the student is under 18, or the student itself, was a hefty fine, possible termination, and further federal penalties. We're talking possible jail time if the information shared led to consequences for the student whose information was shared. All I needed was proof. Along with Aaron's testimony, I wanted irrevocable proof that Karen and Karen Jr. were doing shady crap. So I hatched a plan. I was in the show choir, and so I had access to some decent recording equipment, including some single-use audio recorders. These were used by judges during competitions to give quick feedback on the show, and also for student auditions. They were small, discreet, and silent. They also had a neat feature where you could set a timer on the thing to tell it to start recording after so much time had passed. I set the timer so that the recorder would start during lunch. Before school one day, I went up to Karen's room to glance briefly to see if she was in there. She was not, and her room was not locked. Her classroom was on the 2nd floor, so the stairwell door downstairs alone was locked at night. However, they unlock these doors before school so that the janitors can do some spot cleaning before normal class hours. I taped one of these recorders under her chair, set a timer for around lunchtime and her planning period, they were back to back, and waited. I went back at the end of the day, I had choir practice, and retrieved the recorder before the downstairs doors were locked. They left them unlocked for extracurricular activities because freshman and sophomore lockers were upstairs. I got home and began playing the tape. Bingo. I had my irrefutable evidence. It was all there. Conversations about Karen viewing student transcripts and disclosing that information with a third party, Karen Jr. Now I had another problem. You see, Karen was extremely friendly with the administration, so I had to find someone who I knew would take me seriously and would cooperate, while keeping my identity a secret. Fortunately, my counselor, we were each assigned one based on our last name, was a real stand-up guy, and I knew he'd come in clutch. He also wasn't close with Karen, unlike many of the other counselors and higher-up staff. I went with Aaron to his office, and I took my laptop with the audio file backed up onto it. We presented our case. You see, to file a FERPA violation report, you needed a member of the administration of the offense defending organization. This included my counselor to go on record saying that the complaint was legitimate and that further investigation was warranted. The complaint was also anonymous. He gave me his sweet approval on the form. I filed the complaint and waited. The fallout was glorious. The school's administration was forced to do an objective audit on all of Karen's activity at the school, where they confirmed that all of this bullcrap had been taking place. Karen Jr.'s valedictorian status and her friend's salutatorian status were sacked, and some other, more deserving kid was presented with the honor. I myself was awarded salutatorian, although this didn't matter to me too much. The school was fined by FERPA for breach of policy, and Karen might get fired. I never found out. I was graduated before all of that took place. In retrospect, she probably wasn't fired over this because she knew folks on the county school board, but it's fun to dream. But it doesn't end there. During the audit, they also found evidence that Karen Jr. had been coming to her mom's room during regular tests and copying down answers from the internet, and she faced severe disciplinary action for that. That certainly wouldn't look good on her record. We're talking in-school suspension due to multiple documented violations. The icing on the cake was when they discovered the screwery regarding her ACT accommodations. Turns out, her mom had been pulling the string behind the scenes to get her accommodations for that anxiety we talked about earlier. The ACT company takes cheating very seriously, and so they voided her pristine standardized testing score, which had landed her a full scholarship to her university of choice. The same ended up happening with some of her SAT and AP scores as well, for reasons that I never personally discovered. Karen Jr. lost all of her scholarship money from the university and ended up attending an in-state college, which took the few scores that were not voided, and also weren't fraudulent. Those scores probably weren't near as good as her voided ones. All of this news was absolutely buzzing around the school, and Karen Jr. was disgraced. I did my part in my graduation ceremony a few months later, and all was well. I never intended it to go so far, but I don't feel bad one bit. Revenge is sweet, and best served by FERPA. Thanks for reading. That's a really good story and absolutely terrifying. As great as teachers are, they are not immune to corruption. And teachers are great, possibly the best people in the world. Very beautiful. I'm playing around. But, yeah, anybody can be bad, and always keep a lookout. However, I am a naive individual and have, I guess, potentially dangerous tendency to trust those in charge, because, I mean, they're in charge for a reason, right? And to answer that question, Zach, yes, they are in charge for a reason, and that's because the people that put them in charge are pretty stupid, right? Am I on the right track here to make sure that I'm not some shill under control by those in charge? One might say Big Brother, even. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm rambling. Have a good day. Also, hope you enjoyed my bird.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell to never miss an episode.